All right, so something fishy going on. And what's the, there we go. So this is week one of a brand new series. So God has a calling is the thing. So before that, I feel strange doing this. I feel like I need to do some kind of introductory work a little bit. So I have been at this church for, trying to talk to Nathan because he's the expert on these things. I want to say like 5.5 years that we've been at this church. In spite of that, I kind of hide out, with the kids. So I'm back there, and I started out with the 4 and 5 year old class until they realized that 4 and 5 year olds are more scared of my humor than happy about it. So then they bailed the 4 and 5 year olds out, and they pushed me over across the hall to the 3rd and 4th graders. And that seems to be right about an emotional, intellectual match. So that's where I've stayed for a little while. And so we got that going. But when I'm back with the kids all the time, the problem is I don't get to see a lot of other people. And the other side is I'm pretty much an introvert. I know people that follow me or whatever, friends with me on Facebook and things like that. They think that that's not true, that it can't possibly be this, because all the stupid, weird things that I post, that this guy can't possibly be an introvert, a quiet guy. But that's really is. That's how I am. I've seen my Myers-Briggs. They had me retake it because they thought that part was a lie. But no, it turns out that I really am an introvert. So I'm kind of quiet when I don't. If I know you, I'm in a room with you, I'll talk a lot. But if I don't, I'm kind of going to be off to the side and kind of quiet. So the other part about people not knowing me is that my wife and my kids, they kind of shuttle me off to the side because they're afraid if I talk to people, I'll shame the family. And they probably have good cause, So I'm kind of okay. I understand where they're coming from. But let's go ahead and assume that like half or more of you don't have any idea who I am, and so we'll do this. So this is me, and this is basically what I do, about 80% of my day is drink coffee. I'm not always sitting there. And when I'm not drinking coffee, this is my favorite thing to do, and that is as the wife. And I also have children, and there they are. And the two in the bottom row, those are not sisters. The middle one is the wife, and the other one is the daughter. So they are not sisters. And sometimes the children take a bath, and they look really nice. So there you go. So that's spectacular. The other stuff. So that's all the fun stuff. The other stuff about me. So if I'm trying to figure out about a 3-minute thing. So I grew up in the church, and there's some good and bad in that because there's a lot of good in that. You're sheltered from some things, but you also have a hard time identifying with people that didn't grow up in the church sometimes, and that can be difficult. But the story goes that my mom started the nursery in the church that I grew up in with me as a baby. So that was pretty young. I'm kind of a lifer in this church thing. And so when people would ask me, what do I want to be when I grow up? The answer was always, when I was little, that I wanted to be a pastor or a missionary or something like that. And that was always the answer until I got to about 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that, and realized that nobody ever gives that answer. That is not anybody else's answer. And so then I didn't give an answer. I don't know what I said at that point. Probably computer stuff, because I started doing computer stuff a little later and older. And that's kind of been the parallel tracks, is computer stuff and church stuff. So I did go to college, study ministry and that kind of thing. So I went and I studied religion there, studied computer stuff. So that was kind of a dual track thing in my life there. And I met my wife, got married to her, and before she got smart enough to know better. And then we went on to grad school and started having kids with our degrees. So I did a master's in divinity, and Jennifer did a master's in counseling. And so we did that kind of thing for a while. We had the first 2 of our kids there. And then we went to pastor a church in rural Maryland, Western Maryland. So not all Maryland is Baltimore, but there's some rural parts to it as well. And so there was rural Western Maryland. And so I pastored there for about 4 years. And when I moved to York, the actual reason originally that we moved to York, God may have had other things in mind and other purposes, was we were planting a church. And so it turns out that planting a church is not a highly profitable endeavor. and that finances can be quite difficult. So in the middle of all that, the kids got really difficult. They wanted to eat basically every day, and like multiple times. And so that was difficult. So at some point we realized that I'm going to have to get, so I was working part-time out of the house with that, but okay, I'm going to have to get a real full-time job and then feed these children and do that kind of thing. So God provided, and I did that. And sometime about, I don't know, I think I was still in the middle of the church plan or whatever, a guy came and asked me to do some Celebrate Recovery stuff with him. And I didn't know him, I just met the guy. And so I ended up, I had no idea what Celebrate Recovery was. He said his work schedule, he didn't allow him to go on Friday nights, and could I meet with him? And I'm like, well, I can meet with you. I don't know what this other stuff is, but yeah, sure, I can meet and pray with you. And then his work schedule changed, and he asked me to go to Celebrate Recovery. And the reality is, once I started going, I went for him, and at some point in there, God's like, this is not for him. This is for you. You need to be here. This is where you need to be. And so that's been like 9-10 years, something along those lines. So that's kind of the weird mix of computer nerd, history nerd, Bible nerd, whatever kind of nerd, that's in Celebrate Recovery guy and all these things. So you kind of a weird mix when you get me, and I'm sorry, you're just going to have to deal with it for another half hour or so. You should have checked before you came. All right. So all that gives us down to, and I think that's important because the reality is you have to, all I have to offer is me, right? I mean, that's all I have. We try our best, we try with everything, but the only thing you can give is what you have. And so you should have some idea of who I am and what I have. I'm going to be different than other people, and that's okay, because that's what God does, is he doesn't make us the same. But so I think it's real important that you know a little bit. But we're going to go right into Jonah, and we're going to read through this scripture. So the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh, preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. And just so you know, this is going to go right about 16 verses. So if you have trouble making it 16 verses, are there anybody that are certified, first aid people in the room? Anybody? Go ahead, raise your hand. Certified first aid people in the room? All right, we got, I'm sure there's a couple people. You just seek them out. If you are having trouble making through all 16 verses, we will make it through it. So the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots and find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? What people are you? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher. So they asked him, "What should we do to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. They cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. All right, that is crazy as stories get. Now, I want to go back to the first 3 verses with you and kind of look through that. So here it is. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. "Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. And I think it's maybe a paraphrase would help us out here. God said to Jonah, "Go tell Nineveh that they're about to get their comeuppance." Jonah politely responded, "I don't think so." And then he did his best Carl Lewis impersonation. So I probably should say Usain Bolt. Does that bring it more up to date? Is there anybody, do I need to go the other direction? Anybody need Jesse Owens? Do we have to go the other way? So we all get that. So God engages Jonah. He gives him a message, and then Jonah runs. And honestly, it can be a little bit of a confusing story for us, because there's this whole idea of everybody that comes to church on a Sunday morning. I won't say everybody, but I would have to think the vast majority, even if you're not a believer, even if you haven't given your life to God, there is this sense that you come out and you're here, you're inclined to probably believe that if God tells you to do something, you probably should do it, right? I mean, that's kind of where we're at. Most of the people that sit here, the people that are going to listen to this, the people that are going to be that, they have at the very least, there's an openness to this idea that if God tells you to do something, you should probably do it. So when we read this, that God comes to Jonah, he has this encounter, he engages with him, and he gives him the message. Why does Jonah run? It doesn't make any sense. We have trouble connecting with it. And so let's get a little backstory, and I think that's the biggest problem, because we come into this without having any concept of what's going on with this. So a couple things that would be helpful is Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, and so it's a little bit like when people say, nobody out here, when you read or you're watching the news at night, and I don't even watch the news, because I don't get the remote at home, because I have 3 kids. But I don't know. I'm not sure I'd watch the news anyway. I think I've gotten past that at this point. I read, online or whatever else. But when you watch the news and somebody says, policies in Washington are alienating the middle class, or they're doing whatever, I have no idea what they would say. But whatever they would say, when they talk about policies in Washington, nobody up here in York, Pennsylvania says, "Man, I'm glad I'm not in Washington. Glad we're up in York, Pennsylvania, and that doesn't affect us." Because, of course, policies in Washington affect the whole country, right? And we get that, and we hear if somebody's going to say the political climate in Moscow is such and such, we understand that that's shorthand for Russia, and that's a way to talk about the whole country, or if it's going to be Tehran or whatever the capital is, we get the idea that it's shorthand. So one of the things you need to know is that Nineveh is the capital of Assyria, and it kind of plays out in an important way here as we move along. The Bible tells us about Nineveh in particular that it's a bad place. We'll be a little more specific. There's some pretty good mentions. In this book of Jonah, later on in chapter 3, you're going to hear it reference the people of Nineveh as evil and violent, the people themselves. And when you get to Nahum, the city is called the city of blood, full of lies and endless cruelty. So that sounds like a bad place. I don't want to live there. That's not a neighborhood that I want to hang out with. So the city of blood. So, but there's more to it than this. And so I apologize for this next slide. because it's a map, and I know that some people have this fear of geography and that kind of thing, and they just don't like it. But I will tell you this, that I was hearing TJ talk earlier, and if you stick with me and you get all the way to the end, apparently at the end he has a splashy new dance number he's been working on. And so if you can hang tight with the couple maps that we have, we'll get to the end and you'll get to see that. And I hear what you're saying, but the reality is you'll never know if you don't stay, right? Right? So you can't win if you don't play. So here we go. So you have in this picture, on the left, the big thing of water is the Mediterranean Sea, and so that's not labeled, but you have that. Israel's kind of there and kind of small and in the middle. The Red Sea there is kind of to the right of Egypt, and the big Saudi Arabia is big. That's like cut in half. So Saudi Arabia is the big landmass there to the right of the Red Sea in Egypt, and you have all that there. So that's modern day Middle East. So this the overlay is pretty close when we go to this. This is the Assyrian Empire, and you can kind of get the colors represent historical time periods. So the dark green there is the earliest times in the Assyrian Empire. You can see it's kind of small. Nineveh is actually in there. I don't know if you can read it, but that top red dot inside the dark green is Nineveh. So that's the city we're talking about. And so that's early Assyrian Empire. A little further along in history, you get the kind of medium dark green color there, and it's getting bigger. And then eventually it kind of its largest, most large state, the Assyrian Empire, is that light green color there. And what you get is the little dark green is pretty far away from Israel. The medium color green is getting pretty close. And by the time you get to the other one, you've completely swamped Israel. Okay, so this is context. And at the time of Jonah, when this story is kind of dated, you probably have that middle color of green is probably the size of the Assyrian Empire. Probably some of the light green would be included in there. It jumps a good period of time. So probably the light colored green, some of that would be also in the Assyrian Empire at this time of the story. So you have. Now I got to find my place. All right, there we go. We'll get this. So the best guesses of this is about that Jonah was written about 775, or not that it was written, but that it took place, that he actually lived, and that's when he did his prophecy stuff. So that's about 2,800 years ago, so a long time back. And so let's talk about the backstory of Jonah really quick in this regard. So Jonah was a prophet. We don't really know much about him in the Bible, that we have a very few verses in the Bible. He gets one mention outside of this book, and that is in the book of 2 Kings. And when he gets that mention, here's his message. It's pretty simple. He goes to the king of Israel at the time, and Damascus in the I've lost my place here. Arameans, I can't say all these words. So Damascus and Arameans there, they've taken some of Israel's land, is what's happened. And so Jonahs' message is really simple. He goes to the king of Israel and says, go get our stuff back. And that's his message. And he does, and it works. And so the problem you can kind of get, so Jonahs' message is pretty singular. Go get our stuff back, Israel's stuff. Except Assyria is not much for that, right? Assyria is like, we're going to take your stuff. That's how we work. That's our MO. And so you get the idea that, the people that would have read this for the first time, the book of Jonah, they would have known all this. So that's why I'm telling you. They would have all known this. They would have recognized this. They would have known the history of Assyria and that it's just taken land. And when Assyria takes your land, they pretty much decimate you, so that who they don't kill when they're conquering you, they take and they export you. They exile you. So you're not, it's like whatever you can carry, grab it, you're gone, and you don't have your house, you don't have your stuff, you're living in a different place. It's a way of controlling people. So it was a really difficult place to live. And so Jonah wants nothing to do with the Assyrians, with Nineveh, with their policy, with how they operate. His message is we're going to take our stuff back, and the Assyrians is no, we're going to take your stuff. And so he wants nothing to do with them. It's pretty simple. But here's the problem. He said, I can't get the right slide. No, here's the problem. Jonah wants nothing to do with Nineveh, so he runs. The problem is the word of the Lord already came. God already spoke on the issue. He already said something. And I know that we read things, and I don't think we always get the whole deal, how big a deal this first verse is when it says, the word of the Lord came. You could really just stop there and hang tight with that much of the first chapter of Jonah is the word of the Lord came. Because that, at that point, means something. And so we read things like this as Christians, and people will quote this from Hebrews 4:12. For the word of God is active and alive, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. But I want to read just a little bit of it. For the word of God is alive and active. Okay? When God speaks, stuff happens. Every time. Okay? Let's go back to Genesis and think about this a minute. How does God create anything? Right? God said, let there be light. He didn't go out and build a light bulb. He spoke, okay? God said, let there be light. God said, let there be sky, let there be land. And he keeps going and going. And every time that we read God said something, right afterwards we said, and it was so. Because every time God speaks, stuff happens. Every time. You get Moses, when he gets to Exodus, it's interesting because Moses is having this encounter with God, and he's on the mountain, he's getting the tablets and all these things, and Moses asks God, and he says, I want to see your glory. Yeah, I don't know if you remember the story. And what happens is God says, no, you can't see my glory. That's not how this works. You couldn't bear it. But what God does instead is he covers it, and he speaks to Moses. And he tells him about himself. And God describes himself to Moses and who he is, and about his mercy and about his grace. And so when Moses asks, I want to see, God doesn't give a vision, God gives a word, a message. It is so much so that who God is and what he does and everything about, his word is so closely identified with God that when you get to the Gospel of John, John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John says Jesus is God. Jesus is the Word. And ultimately, it says that the Word became flesh, and he walked among us. And that's Jesus. So, God has spoken, and Jonah has a problem because he doesn't want to do this, but God said already. So you got to go back to verse 3. What does Jonah do? So Jonah is in the boat. This is not in the right order. We will make it in the right order. There we go. That was good. So Jonah's in the boat. And here's what he does. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. We leave God and we run away, and we know what we're doing, and we pay to do it. I mean, that's how it happens. We know what God is asking us to do, and we know it's going to cost us something. I mean, it's not always money where we hand somebody something. Sometimes it's our relationships, our family, our friends. But when God calls us to do something and we run away from it, we leave it, we literally pay to run away from God. We pay to leave. We pay to walk away. And so Jonah does. He pays. He goes and he gives somebody money and he says, I want to go away. It's going to cost me. And so he goes and he flees from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo of the sea into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we do not perish. Now, I have to tell you, things get to feeling pretty weird here. Does this story feel familiar to anybody? I mean, do you get a vibe here? So again, it begins to get weird. And the problem for me is it's not that it's weird because it sounds like Jonah's story. It's weird because it sounds like Jesus' story, right? So Jesus in a boat, in a storm, asleep. I mean, a lot of us have heard this. And so let's skip ahead. I want to read, we're going to skip around here. So here we go. So Jesus in the boat. Just read some of this. One day Jesus said to his disciples, Let us go over to the other side of the lake. So they got into the boat and set out. As they sailed, he fell asleep. A squall came down on the lake so that the boat was being swamped and they were in great danger. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we're going to drown. Now here's the interesting parallels in this. They're both in a boat. It's as straight up simple as you get. That's easy. But a storm comes up. Everyone panics, except Jesus and Jonah, right? Everyone panics because they're asleep. That's why they don't panic. So it's on the surface, there's this immediate connection where you see it, and that they are similar stories, they're connected stories. And yet the contrast is pretty amazing. Because Jesus is exhausted from doing ministry. I mean, that's what he has done. He is out serving people. He is just fed, depending on which story you're at, he has just fed thousands of people, which version you're reading in the Gospels. So he has done all this stuff, and in his ministering, he is healing people, he is feeding people, he is taking care of them. They are like sheep without a shepherd, and he has compassion on them. But Jonah is exhausted because he is running away from ministry. And that's why he's exhausted. Jesus sleeps because of his identification with the people. He identifies with them. He has come to walk among them. He is, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that's what Jesus is doing. He identifies with people. Even Jerusalem, who he cannot save, he is going to weep for them. He can't save them. He can't convince them what to do. But he is going to go out, and he is so identified with them that he is at the city edge, and he weeps over Jerusalem. And he is identified with these people. They are his people. And Jonah sleeps because he has no identification with these people. So when you get to Jonah, he... in large part, he sleeps because he doesn't really care what happens. Okay? He in no way identifies with the sailors, with anybody lost around him. The sailors, the ship, the storm, none of that is Jonah's problem. Not a bit of it. It is somebody else's stuff. It is their problem. It is their thing. It is their issue. And because of that, Jonah doesn't really care what happens because it's not his problem until God makes it his problem, right? So, at some point, Jonah is in the ship and everything is such a mess. And they come to him and they shake him and they try to grab a hold of him and they wake him up and they say, hey, we're all going to die. So now it's not just the sailors' problem. The sailors aren't going to just die if this ship goes down. Jonah's going to die, all their stuff, everything they have, it's all going to be lost. It is no longer just somebody else's problem. Because God has come in and turned things around in such a way that all these people that you're running from Nineveh, all these stuff that you want to do, these people that are not God's people, that are not your issue, your problem, your stuff, you want to separate yourself from them, I am going to put you in a boat. And I'm going to make it so bad that everything that happens to these sailors is going to be exactly what happens to you. And so God makes it his problem. And here's the thing, when God's calling comes in our lives, when God makes somebody else's problem our problem. When Jesus comes, he cannot fix, this is, it's hard for me because you got to deal with codependent stuff. You can't own somebody else's problem, okay? But you have to be in the boat with them. You can't, he couldn't save Jerusalem. They had to choose. But he wept with them. When God comes in and he moves us, I don't think we get the incarnation. I don't think we get the incarnation. It's just, use the words. The incarnation is when Jesus became flesh, right? When he became a man, a human being, and the Word became flesh. And what it means is there's no more separation between your stuff and my stuff. We are in this together. So when we look and we say, man, the drug problem is really terrible. Wish those people would get that fixed. Wish they would get past it. Because we can't have any of this artificial separation. I can't separate myself from you. That is artificial. We are in this together. We, together, collectively, can't separate our destiny and what happens with us with people outside there. It is an artificial separation that God defeats when he leaves heaven and he comes on the earth and he says, your destiny is my destiny. I'm going to walk with you. If you are doomed to die, I'm going to go with you and I'm going to walk to the cross to die. We cannot any longer have other people's stuff just be their stuff, just be their problem. God's calling comes when we are in the same boat and are going to experience the same fate. When we go down to Guatemala and maybe the kids that we birthed there are just as hungry as the kids that are across the street, right? When we enter school systems that people don't want to be in. When somebody else's kids hurting hurts us like our own kids hurting, right? There can't be any of this false separation because the calling is when we are in the same boat. There is no salvation without incarnation, right? If Jesus doesn't come, we aren't saved. And if we don't go, whoever, isn't saved if we don't go. Let's pray. I think I want the prayer to be that Jesus would put us in a boat that's sinking with other people that need mercy. Jesus, come and speak to us. Maybe we are already in a boat that is sinking, that has a mess, and we are sleeping off to the side because we have not owned it as our own problem. But maybe, Lord, we need to be dumped in a boat. Maybe we need to be put with people that desperately need grace and mercy so that their problem becomes our problem. Let us hear your calling and speak your word over us. Jesus, I pray that your word would come to us today and that you would confront us with your mercy and your grace. In your name I pray. Amen.